Alright, so last video I did most of the weight painting. Like I said, it's probably not perfect, but it never will be. But for now, it is good enough. So I want to move on to the control objects, the control rig. And I often will make most of those out of simple NURBS curve shapes, like circles and cubes and things like that. But you can also make custom shapes in Illustrator, export them, and import them as SVGs into Maya. But I'm going to use the simple ones for the time being, like circles. If I go to create an representative circle, but I don't want to use the square because a square is not actually a shape. It is 4 lines stuck in a group, and that's just a pain to work with. Instead, if I want something that has a different shape, I have to make my own. One of the shapes I like to make are boxes, and I like to use the cubes, the polygon cubes, as a sort of a basis for making those box shapes. But I can't use this itself because I want to use something that's not going to render at render time. The curves will not render at render time. They only show up here. So I'm going to go to Create, Curve Tools. I like to use the EP Curve Tool. But you notice if I start clicking with the EP Curve Tool, I start getting, well, curves, as the name would suggest. I want straight lines for my cube. So I'm going to delete that. Go back to the Curve Tools, EP Curve Tool. I'm going to click the little option box on the right. I'm going to set this to linear, 1 linear, and that's going to create straight lines. And I've snapped this perfectly onto the vertices of this cube right here. I'm going to hold down V, and if I click near a vertex, it's going to snap directly onto that vertex. And you can see it creates a line there, and a line there, there, and there. And then I can move on to the next face. It does not matter if I overlap some of the previous edges. You're not going to see that. You're just going to see the resultant line. So I'm just going to go around and around and around, spiraling around each face until I've got every face taken care of. And by going all the way around these 4 faces on the sides, it'll automatically create the faces for the edges for the faces on top and bottom too. So I can select my original cube, delete that, and this is my new cube right here. And I'm just going to duplicate that and reuse it whenever I need a cube. And for everything else, I'll probably use a circle, since I already got one of those right there. Now, a lot of times it is easier to see what I'm doing if I turn off my body and clothing layers, just so I can see where the bones are without accidentally clicking on the skin. But for things like, say, the root control, which I'm going to start with, I like to turn those off. Hold down V, snap that, V, and snap that onto the center bone that is sort of the parent for everything. But then I want to make sure this is big enough that I can see it even with the clothing still there. So I'm just going to scale that out. And as my root control. But I also want a secondary control. That's for my hips override. That's the whole point of creating the hips override, is they control the hips separately from the root, which is everything. So I'm going to select this, duplicate it, Control D, and then scale it down a little bit. I'm going to select both of these. I'm going to freeze transformations. If you don't already have that on your shelf, it's a good idea to have that on your shelf. I thought I had it on my shelf. I know I've got my delete history, which is right here. That's under Edit, Delete by Type History. You know what? If you don't know how to add stuff to your shelf, this is how you do it. Modify freeze transformations, Control Shift, and click on it. And there it is, right there. I'm shocked I don't have it. Normally, it's one of the first things I add. Anyway, this root control right here, I'm going to rename this to root CTRL for control. Hips override control, I will rename to hips override CTRL for hips override control. I'm going to shift select this right here. I'm going to shift select the outer control and hit P, and now these are parented. So wherever the root control goes, the hips override will go with it. And the root control, I'm going to select this first, shift select that. I don't parent these together. I use something called a constraint. And a constraint means that they are not connected through the hierarchy. Like if I were to open up my Windows outliner and find the root control right here, the hips override is parented to my root control. This is a hierarchy right here. If I select this, then shift select this, the root joint right there, I'm going to go up here to constrain and use a parent constraint. It's not the same as the parent. It's a parent constraint. It has a lot of the same results as a parent constraint, but there's no connection through the outliner right here. They still remain separate, which means I can select this and nothing else gets selected. But if I move this, it moves with it, or rotate or move, either one. Next, I will select my hips override control, shift select my hips override joint, and I'm going to tell this to use an orient constraint, because the only thing I want this one to do is to change the rotation, so this one will only orient it. Which is a bit easier to see. I might just delete those delete that for the time being. Well, maybe I'll put this in a layer and hide that layer there. Now you can see a little easier. And you should be in the body layer. What's happened when I recombined them in the last video? Anyway. So the constraints, you go select the control object first, and the object is being controlled, in this case the joints, second. So that now has the hips override and the root control all being sorted out. Next, I'm going to work on the legs. Now, I'm going to use something called a reverse footlock to control my legs, and that is a little bit difficult to explain exactly what it does, but the idea is I'm going to create a second skeleton that's going to go in reverse, starting at the heel, then jumping forward to the toes, and working their way back up to the ankles. And this is used to help anchor the foot to the ground in a way that is natural to the way a foot would normally sit on the ground. And it is difficult to explain how and why it works. I'm going to be honest with you, I was doing it just because I was told to do it for a very, very long time until it started to make sense to me. And that's what I'm going to recommend to you. Just trust me on this one. It works. And the more you work with it, the more it'll make sense as to why it works. So I'm going to go to my side view, move down here to the feet, and I always start, no matter what the shape of the foot is, with where the back of the foot, oops, wrong ones, where the back of the foot is. The part that's going to be resting on the foot if you were to sort of tilt up on your back heels. If you've got normal feet, this would be the heel. If you're wearing high heels, it would be the little spike of the high heel. If you've got weird digitigrade legs, where you're actually standing on the toes, then it'd be where the back of the toes would be. In this case, it's got the toes here, but it's also got the toes back here. So I'm going to start with create joints back here where these toes meet, then up to the front toes, up to the ball of foot, and up to the ankle. And this is my reverse foot control object. And I want this to be lined up with this foot. I also want to rename the joints within it. So the back one with the starting point, I'm going to call that the left RF reverse foot heel. Then down, left, reverse foot, toe, left, reverse foot, ball, and left, reverse foot, ankle. And these are not going to be connected to the rest of the joints at all. They're just going to be floating on their own, controlled by the leg controls, which I will make in a minute. Now, I can mirror these over, skeleton, mirror joints is using the exact same setup as before. L gets turned into R. Now these are the right reverse foot locks. And I'm going to create the leg control itself out of a circle. And I'm going to snap this onto my heel, make this a bit bigger. And now I will use the control vertices. Oh, come on. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to select this with that bone in the way. So I click on that, I should be able to sort of left and right. There we go. I use my left and right buttons on my keyboard. I can sort of scroll around which of the vertices I have selected. And this is not required, but I do kind of like to, make these the same shape roughly as the foot, just to indicate this is a foot. If I turn my body back on again, you can see that kind of outlines the shape of this foot object. And I'm going to duplicate that, snap this one over onto this one. And this is the left leg control and the right leg control. Select them both, freeze transformations, late history. Now, I'm going to control the way the legs bend with something called inverse kinematics. There are two types of motion in bones, especially for arms and legs, stuff like that. Forward kinematics and inverse kinematics. Forward kinematics means you start at, say, the shoulder, pose that, then you go forward to the next joint, pose that, forward to the next joint, pose that, etc., etc. Inverse kinematics means I can just grab the endpoint and move that around, and wherever it goes, the other joints behind it will adjust themselves to match up with where the end goes. And that is how I'm going to do the legs and the arms. If I go to skeleton, create IK, inverse kinematic handle, I'll go to option box, and there's two types of inverse kinematics, single chain and rotate plane. Single chain is for very, very basic, this doesn't really do much of anything type joints. Rotate plane is for things that are a bit more complicated. This allows you to, say, point the knee in different directions depending on how the leg is posed. And that's what I want to do for, say, my knees and eventually my elbows. So I'm going to set this to rotate plane. And to use this, I'll start by clicking at the base of the leg up here, the hip, and then the ankle down here. And now if I move this around, the entire leg will move to fit it. So I'm going to do another one over here, the other leg, down to the ankle. And this is the ankle, not the reverse foot ankle. That one does not do anything at the moment. That's going to be used to sort of control how these IKs work in a few minutes. But I also want IKs between here and here, because you'll notice if I pull this, the leg won't go any further than the bones at their current length will allow it to go. If I were to grab this and move it, the leg stretches, or the foot stretches, I guess. If I use the single plane solver between each of these bones, one at a time, then it will guarantee that your toes don't get stretched longer than they need to be. So I go single chain, click at the base of the foot, the ankle, and then to the ball of the foot. That creates one IK, and this will now never move longer than that original bone will allow it. And the next one from here to here, and the same in the other foot. Like that. Now, as for the back toes, I don't want to do anything particularly complicated with these. I'm not going to use reverse foot controls on those. I just want them to sort of be anchored to the ground and to bend as the rest of the foot bends. So I'm going to keep with the single chain. But instead of going from here to here and then here to here, I'm just going to go from the base of the toe to the end of the toe, base of the toe, end of the toe, like that, and like that. And now these will bend like that. And I want these to pretty much just stay anchored to wherever the ground is, no matter what the rest of the foot does. So to do that, I'm going to use my leg control right here, and it's going to be the parent to these objects right here, the parent constraint on those objects. So constrain parent. Once again, I select the control object first and the object being controlled second. And no, I cannot do all the IKs at once because I'm only using the one control object, but if I have multiple objects selected, they will all be treated as a control object, and only the last IK selected will be the object being controlled. You can only have one object being controlled by constraints at a time, but you can have multiple controlling objects. There, now, if this were to move, those will move with it. See that? But I do want the reverse footlock to be parented, just regular parent to this and to this. And when these move, the reverse foot moves with it. And the reverse foot is what's going to control the IKs here. So each joint of the reverse foot that's nearest the IK is going to be the parent constraint control object for the IK. So constrain parent, select the reverse foot first, shift select the IK, constrain parent. The joint first, IK second, constrain parent. And because this is parented to the foot control, if I move this, everything moves up with it. I'll do the same for this foot over here. Joint first, IK second, parent constraint. Joint first, IK second, parent constraint. Joint first, IK second, parent constraint. I would turn my body back on and my lights so I can actually see it. If I move my foot, see everything tries to stay on the ground. The last thing that gets lifted up is always the toe because that's still being controlled by this part right here. Like a very natural movement of my foot. But not only that, if I were to grab the individual joints and rotate these, you see what that does? Or that. If I go back to the base, I can lift it up on the back toes like that. Grind the heel in there, like that. So I get very natural motions with this. That's why I like to use the reverse footlock. A lot of these bones will just bend in a natural way without me having to do anything to it. Not only that, but now that they're locked onto the ground, watch what happens. Put the whole body back on. If I move my root control, see that? They stay on the ground and the legs bend. I move my hips around, rotate these, like that. Next thing I want is to be able to control the position, or the orientation of the knees. And I'm going to use my box control for that. I'm going to duplicate this rather than using the original one. And I like to give these sort of a shape that is kind of a pointy shape to it like this. I'm going to duplicate this for both knees, and because I know I'm going to need these for the elbows too later, I'm going to duplicate them again and just have those sitting around for when I need them. Go. Now, the thing about the knee controls, which is called a pole constraint, by the way, or I guess a pole vector, to be more accurate, is that it sits in a space that it has to sit in a position that is perfectly angled in front of the current position of the knee. If I have it off slightly, the knee will twist to one side, and that'll change the position of my body as well. And I want to keep this in the original pose as much as possible until I'm ready to start posing it intentionally. And the only way I've found to get this perfectly within the knees and then in front of them is to use a bit of a trick that actually relies on using my constraints to do that. So I'm going to start off by setting the hang on, got a bunch of other stuff selected. Selecting the hips, the knee, and the ankle. And then I'm going to use something called a point constraint, which is going to control the position of these objects. Right here, like this one right there. I'm going to put this perfectly inside of these three, in the center of these three joints. So I'm going to go to my constraint, point constraint, and you can see where it says maintain offset. By leaving this off, it will not leave it in its original position. It will instead force it to exist within this triangle right here. So I'm going to hit add, and now it's within that triangle. I'll do the same thing for the other one. Shift select all three joints, and then this control last, constrain, point, and now it's in the center. Now the constraint, I only use that in order to position these where I want to start them. I don't want these to be controlled by these joints. These objects are, in fact, they control objects. I don't want them to be controlled by anything. So I'm going to find them in my outliner, and you can see that these two objects right here have little plus signs next to them. If I open those plus signs up, this is the point constraint I just added to them. And if I can select them, I can delete them. And now they're gone. And now they're not being controlled by anything. I also want these to be aimed directly at the knees, so I can then move these through the knees and put them directly and perfectly in front of them. So I'm going to select this knee right here. I'm going to shift select the object and go to constraint, and there's something called an aim constraint. I've also got the maintain offset turned off here. And the aim vector is which one of these axes is going to be aimed at this object. And you can see X, Y, and Z, X, Y, Z. If I got my X and Y set to 0, that means it's not going to use those at all. My Z is set to 1, which means it's going to only look at my Z. So this is being aimed down the Z axis. Hit apply, and now it's pointing at the knee. Same thing over here. Select my knee first, my object second, hit apply, and now it's aimed at the knee. And just like before, I don't want these constraints to be controlling it in the future. I just created them so I could control the angles and the positioning of these objects to start with. I'm going to delete both of those constraints. And now they're pointing at the knees. I'm going to turn my objects back on again, and I'm going to move these on the z-axis. By the way, if you try to do this and the z-axis is not pointing in the same direction that the objects are, that's because if I double-click my move tool over here, you're not set to object, you're set to world. Make sure this is set to object, so the axes are pointing the same direction that the objects are. And I'm just going to move these until there's somewhere where I can see them. I don't want to go too far because they're going to trade places, but I do want them somewhere where I can see the objects outside of the skirt. If this wasn't so large, it'd be a little bit easier to position them, but I'm stuck with what I've got. So I've got these positioned where I want them. I'm going to hide those again so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to freeze my transformations, or that right there. And the angles that I had before, the arrows, all that, that was just to help me position them. Now that I've got them where I want them, I don't really care about that anymore. I want this transform set to 0, so this is their new home. And I'm going to parent this to that foot, and leg control, shift, select this one, parent that to this one. Now when I move these, those will move with it. Now they're not doing anything yet, so I'm going to select my whole object, and then shift select the IK at the ankle, constrain, pole vector. Like the other one over here, shift select my IK, constrain, pole vector. And now if I move these, the knees will move with it. And it only does that because I used the rotate plane IK solver. Turn the legs back on just so you can see what it looks like. Look at that. Make sure I name these objects. Always name your control objects. Name everything in your scene. Is my left knee pole and my right knee pole. And there we go. And my legs and my hips taken care of. Now I do want to do one more thing for the legs, which is I'm going to create some new channels, these little controls over here on the right. You've got translate, rotate, and scale. I can create custom ones as well. I want to create custom ones that let me control the position of these joints in my reverse footlock rather than having to select and move them on my own. So I'm going to go to Edit, Add Attribute. If I select them both, I can do them both at the same time. I'm going to set this to Vector. That will create controls with X, Y, and Z attributes. So like this is X, Y, and Z for scale. So I'm going to start off with, say, my heel. Add. And now I've got heel X, Y, and Z. Toe. Add. Ball. Add. And I don't need the ankle because the ankle doesn't really do anything. It just sort of moves at the end of everything else. So now both of these have those 3 new controls with X, Y, and Z attributes. But I want these to, I'm just going to hide that again. I want these to actually control the joints, and by default, they're not going to do that. So I have to tell it to use these controls to control the joints. I'm going to go to Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor. We got outputs and inputs. It's going to output from here. So I'm going to select this and reload left and input to one of these joints on the right here, inputs. So I reload right. And now I look through here and I'm going to find my heel. I'm going to look through here and find my rotate. And just by clicking on them, I create an association between them. Now if I were to change my heel it'll change the heel there. It'll change the heel there. It'll change the rotate. It'll change the rotate. If I want to control the toe, I first selected here, but I'm still using the heel on the right. So I now select my toe joint, reload right, and now select my rotate for that one. The ball, I select the ball joint, reload right, and now connect those. And I do the same thing on the other side. So I start by reloading the left to get this over here. Select my heel joint, reload right, connect that to the rotate, reload right again to go the toe to rotate, reload right, ball to rotate. And now they're being controlled by my feet. And these I can just hide with H. So I don't see them anymore. I don't need them. They exist, but they're hidden. I don't have to worry about accidentally clicking on them and messing them up because they're being controlled by this, and they're completely invisible other than that. All right. Next, I'll move on to the arms. I'm going to create a control object for the arm right here. But in order to make sure that the rotations on the wrist right here are moving in a direction that makes sense, what I want is to have my arm controls, my hand controls, in the same axis, the same angle as this. This whole setup right here. So I'm going to start by creating a circle. And if I were to have this, perfectly oriented, let's do a quick rotate right here to match this. If I want to then later on rotate this around and then put it back to the original position, what do I have to type over here? I got to type all this weird stuff. Well, I don't want to do that. I always want to make sure I freeze transformations. But now if I freeze transformations, the rotation is not matching the angle that I have it set at. So I don't want to do that. Instead, what I always like to do is I like to put it in a group. And the group will keep those angles. And this object right here will just be set to the regular defaults. If I put this in a group and hit Control G on that object and rotate the group however I want, there's a group one right here. If I click on the circle itself, which is inside the group, it's still set to 0. All the rotations are on the group. So everything is going to be left in the group, and I will not freeze transformations on the group. Just going to move this, first of all, up here. Make sure it's large enough. The up arrow, I can get back to my group. That fits that. There we go. And I want this to match the angle of this bone right here or this bone right there, one or the other. So I'm going to make sure I have my group selected. I'm going to name this L arm control group. This inside will be the L arm control. I'm going to need a second one, so I'm going to duplicate this and scale it in slightly. This will be my L hand control. There we go. I got these three. I've got the L arm control, L arm group, so the L arm control itself, and the L arm hand control. I want this to be parented. The arm control. So this goes one controlling the next, controlling the next. And I'm going to temporarily parent this to my arm right here. So I'm going to select my group, shift select my arm joint, and hit P for parent. And that'll automatically change my rotates to match the angle of this right here. All I got to do is select up arrow, select my control again, and set these to 0. And it is lined up with that. The circles themselves are a bit odd, but I'll fix that in a second. And then Shift P to unparent, and they're no longer parented to that object. I need to do the same thing for the other side, so I'm going to hit Control D, snap these over here, Shift select that, press P, set my rotates to 0, and then Shift P to unparent them again. Now I want these to be at a 90 degree, so I should be able to select them, hold down J and rotate these 90 degrees, and then freeze transform so they're at that position to start with. Now if you look at these have the angles, but these circles do not. All the angles are in the groups. And the hand control and the arm control are both set to 0. I do want to change the names for my right ones. So there's going to be right arm control group. And there's going to be right arm control and right hand control. There we go. Next, I'm going to create IKs for the shoulders to the wrists, as well as from the, well, this says shoulder, but in my mind, this will always be the clavicle. And this is the arm. That's just how Mixamo names these things, but in my mind, this is the clavicle and this is the shoulder, but whatever. I'm going to create a single chain from here to here. And because the last thing I did was a single chain, I'm just going to go straight from there, click from here to here, and there to there. So those got the 2 single chains, and then set this back to rotate plane because I want to be able to control the angles of my elbow from the shoulder down to the wrist with the rotate plane solver turned on, shoulder to wrist. There we go. And my arm control will be the parent constraint control object for my IK right here. Constrain parent. Same thing on this side. Constrain parent. While the hand control will be constraining the wrist joint itself. So constrain, orient, select, select, constrain, orient. And now if I rotate this, it'll rotate in an angle that makes sense for the hand and the arm and all that. And this, I can also move in and out, and the IK will just bend the arm. I want to move my two poles into position the same way I did for my knees. So I'm going to start by selecting the three joints that create the triangle. Oops, there we go. Shift select this last, constrain point, and that puts it inside the triangle. Same thing over here. This joint, and this joint. Shift select, constrain point, and that is also inside the triangle. I also want to make sure I always get rid of the constraints after I make them. These are not supposed to be constrained. They're just there temporarily to get them moved where I want them. Next, I want to change the angle. So I'm going to have these aimed at the elbows. So I'm going to shift the elbow first, the object second. Constrain, aim, select, shift select, constrain, aim. Select the constraints and delete them. Grab both my control objects, turn my body and my cloth back on. I'm going to turn this back on so I can see it. There we are. And move these through the elbows. The knees go towards the front. The elbow controls go towards the back because that is the angles that our knees and elbows point. This looks like a really broad arrow right here. Really broad arrow. That's pointing the direction I want these to go. Turn everything back off again. This is my left elbow hole, my right elbow hole. And I'm going to show you something interesting here. If I freeze transformations on my right one first, but then go and parent this to my arm control with select this, select this, press P, you'll notice that I've got all these numbers in here. And I got freeze transformations a second time. Whereas if I just select this, shift select this, and press P, and then freeze transformations, I'll have to freeze transformations once that way. It doesn't matter as long as you freeze transformations after you're done parenting to this. Doesn't matter if you do it twice or once or a million times. And next I will select my pole, shift select the IK, constrain, pole vector, pole object, shift select my IK, constrain, pole vector. And now if I move these, the elbows change positions. If I move my arm around, they will move with it, like that. Next thing I want is to add controls to my hand controls for my finger and thumb. If I had multiple fingers, I would have a bunch of controls for those, and there's one for the thumb, but as it is, I've got one finger and one thumb. What I want is to be able to rotate this. I'm not sure if I like the angle that's at. What I might do real quick is to change the angle of these. They will rotate towards the thumb. So I'm going to, first things first, skin. I'm going to tell it to move skin weight so I can adjust these without messing things up. Then I'll go to my select component type, question mark, and now I can rotate these that they're aimed at the thumb. There. Back. Okay, what I want to do is be able to like close the pincer by moving this towards the thumb like that. Hang on, that's still not quite right, but good enough for now, at least in the general area. I also want to be able to wiggle it back and forth so I can adjust that if I need to, and twist it. Same thing for the thumb. I want to be able to rotate my thumb closed, as well as to wiggle it left and right, twist or twist it. So I'm going to need those 6 controls for my finger and thumb. Just like both my hands, edit, add attribute. And it's a vector. I'm going to go to float. I'm going to have finger. Normally I call this finger curl, but I guess it's more. I'm just going to keep calling it curl just because even though if the finger can't curl, I'm just going to call it that anyway. Curl. And by the way, I'm using float instead of vector, so I can have one for each of the 3 different controls. And I'm going to set this down here, minimum and maximum. I'm going to go from -5 to 10 just to give it some wiggle both directions, but not too much. I want to be able to stop my fingers and my thumb from rotating too far. So I got -5 to 10, hit add. Now I got finger curl, finger twist. And this one is going to be the same both ways. -10 to +10. The reason why the curl is -5 to +10 is because I don't want to go as far the opposite direction as it would in this direction. Fingers don't tend to do as much this way as I do this way. Hopefully they'll make more sense when I'm working with the thumb. Finger twist. Normally I would call this finger spread so you can spread out your fingers. So since I can't think of anything else to call it right now, I'm going to keep calling it the same thing, finger spread. There. Oops, I hit OK instead of make the next one. I'll go back to add attribute. Gotta be careful, hit add, you'll just add it. If you hit OK, it'll close this window. Thumb curl, I'll do the same thing, -5, +10. Thumb twist, they'll twist the same amount in both directions. And since I'm just keeping with the same naming conventions I would normally use, why not? Thumb spread. And now I could OK. And now it's finished adding them. And because I had these both selected, they're in both hand controls. Next, because he's not doing anything, I want to use, instead of the connection editor that I use for the reverse footlock down there, I'm going to use something called a set-driven key. Now, set-driven keys are, technically, they are considered animation. I'm co-opting them for my rigging, so I'm going to go to my animation menu set, and there's key, set-driven key, set. Now, this is the driver, so I'm going to select this and tell it to load driver. There's finger curl right there and all the others. This is going to be the driven, so I'm going to click that and click here, and now this is in driven. I want the finger curl to control one of these three axes right here. In this case, it's going to be the y-axis, because that's the one that curls in that direction. So I'm going to set this to rotate y, and I'm going to start with my finger curl in the 0 position, the default position. I'm going to tell it to key at the default. Then I'm going to set my finger curl to +10 and rotate this as much as it would make sense to rotate this finger in this direction. So maybe, let's say, -30, because it's going to kind of go until it reaches the thumb pretty much, and hit key again. And now, when I go back to my hand control right here, find my finger curl, if I change this from 0 to 10, it'll blend back and forth between those two positions. Take it all the way to -5, I can now say, well, I want this to open up in this direction, maybe 20. So not as much as it moved in that direction, and hit key. And now I can move between those two positions based on my finger curl control right here. Set that back to 0, goes back to default. For the twist, I'm going to select my finger twist, turn it off again so I can see what I'm doing. And look at this, I want this to twist like this, right? Now this is Y and Z, this must be my X, so I'm going to select my rotate X. So by clicking on my finger twist here, my rotate X there, I'm creating a connection between them. But it will not really exist until I hit the key button. And I can see right there's a little box next to rotate X. Go back to my hand control, finger twist, take up to +10. And I got to decide which direction is positive and which direction is negative. I don't really know. I just pick one arbitrarily and say, well, this is going to be positive twist. I guess make that a -30. Key that. By the way, if I just click over here, I can just click and highlight the object as well. So I can click on that, go back to my hand control, set this finger twist down to -30. Now rotate X that direction, make this one 30. Key that. And now I can use my finger twist to control the twisted position of this. So if I need to rotate that way and then curl it, oops, wrong one, finger curl. And that. Then create different positions with that. Next, I'm going to do the spread. And the only one left is my rotate X. So I'm going to click my rotate X. That's this one right here. Key it at the default position. Go back to my hand control, finger spread, and go that way. And that's going to be either this way or that way. That doesn't really matter. I'll just pick this direction. Key. By the way, I'm doing 20s and 30s and that kind of thing, just so I can easily remember what the numbers are when I move to the other hand. That's the only reason I'm picking those numbers. You can pick whatever number you like. I did key it, right? Yep, negative. Same amount in that direction. Negative 30. Now wiggle back and forth like this. Now for the thumb, I want to curl this so all three of these joints curl at once. So I'm going to select all three of these, and all three of those will now be my driven. So I can see all three of them right here. And I'm going to set, let's see, which one of these? I think that's the Z. Yeah, rotate Z, that's being controlled here. So I'm going to change this to thumb control and rotate Z. So my thumb control is going to control the rotate Z of all three of my thumb joints. So I'm going to key that at the default, the little blue box right there. Increase my thumb control, like those again, and then rotate these until they're as curled as I want them to be. Let's say negative 45. I can remember those numbers pretty easily, 20, 30, 45. Key that, and then curl that the opposite direction. And these will curl less in this direction because thumbs don't tend to spread out as far when they open up. So I'll make this one 30. Key that. Look at that. Back to 0. Next, thumb twist, but I only need this right here for the twist. So I'm going to redo my load driven. And the twist is going to be in the rotate X, that's the red one. I select there. So twist will control the rotate X of my thumb 1. So I'm going to key. Rotate X, got the little blue box. Increase my thumb twist. Rotate that. I'll do 45. Oops. Make sure I got that highlight. 45 from a thumb twist. Because I think this is going to be more mobile than this one will be. And the negative, same thing. 45 the other direction. Key it. Always make sure I select them and key it. And I can wiggle back and forth. Set that to 0. Thumb spread. What's left? It should be the rotate Y. So click my rotate Y. Key that. Thumb spread. Move that away from the hand so I can spread. If I spread this one, will go this way. This one will go that way, so I'll spread them out. There we go. So if I were to select here and here, you can see it spreads them in opposite directions. This is kind of arbitrary right now, to be honest with you. It doesn't really matter which way I go. If I had fingers, the spread would spread the fingers away from each other, but I don't have more than one finger. So instead, I'm kind of using the spread to make the finger and thumb move away from themselves like that. And now I'm just going to quickly do the same thing on the other hand. So this one was all 30s and 20s. This was all 45s. And I think a 30 for the spread that direction. 30s and 20s, 45 and 30. I'll start off by selecting my hand control. I'm going to reload the new driver. Otherwise, these are going to still be controlled by this side. So my finger, load driven, finger curl. And that is the Y direction. It's going to be different on each joint, depending on which direction they're oriented in. That is this direction right there, yep. And now I'm just going to speed through it. Sure, I know which one I'm doing, which direction this is. There we go. Fingers done. That is usually the most tedious part of the entire project. Although I'm pretty sure that's going to be even more tedious once I get to the antennas, but whatever. I'm going to do a quick file save soon as, because I don't want to do that twice.